All right, welcome to Hair Metal Revolution, guys. This is a live show today. This is actually the second live show ever on this channel, and I'm having with Steve Rosen, where we're talking Van Halen. And Steve, when I think of Van Halen, they are one of the most intriguing bands, in my opinion, of our lifetime. Where it's a band that you really want to truly study. And I can't wait to listen to you, find out when did you met Eddie and about your book, about your audiobook. I mean, this is going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. So guys, let's get ready. Let's get started. So Steve, is there ever going to be a band like Van Halen again? Because if you think about it, Steve, I start thinking about this. If you look at the 70s, right? Because Van Halen started, 1978 with their debut album. Yeah. If you look at like Black Sabbath, they developed being considered, godfather of metal, right? A few albums, building that army, building that reputation, the legend. Aerosmith didn't really get super started until they hit their third album with the hit songs, knowing the Aerosmith of today. You go look at Kiss from the 70s. They didn't have their first really $1 million album until the live album. But when you look at Van Halen right from the start, from their debut album, everybody wanted to be a frontman like David Lee Roth. Everybody wanted, like, who the hell is this Eddie guy on the guitar? You know what I mean? I do. I'm not saying they're better or worse than Aerosmith, Black Sabbath, but they started more with the bang, where they totally, I feel, changed. Where bands, Motley Crue said themselves that we need to find a lead singer like David Lee Roth. So they got Vince Neil, the blonde hair, and there was a story that Motley Crue said that they were even thinking about replacing Mick Mars because everybody got to have that shedder, that Randy Rose, the Eddie Van Halen. They were like the new kids on the block in so many ways. I mean, am I wrong thinking that they're just intriguing all the way around?
Yeah, no, man, Eric, that's an interesting way to look at it, and it is true. And specifically, what's so remarkable about Edward? Well, the entire band. So I meet Edward July 1977. So this is 8 months before that first record comes out. And July 77, they've signed the deal on Warner's. That record hasn't come out yet. But they're still playing the whiskey. They still did whiskey shows. I think they graduated from the Starwood, which was kind of the other, rock club in Hollywood. So they were now playing the whiskey. But in July 77, they were playing the whiskey. So between July 77 and the record comes out in February 78, they go out and do that first tour, opening for Montrose and Journey. By the end of 78, they're headlining. I mean, that in and of itself is pretty freaking remarkable. The second record comes out and they're totally headlining. And those other bands that you cited, yeah, man, I don't think any of those bands ever headlined.
No, they had to build their army, like the Kiss Army. They built the Kiss Army. And, Ozzy, not everybody wanted to be Ozzy off their first album. It took a while, Van Halen is just like, boom, out of nowhere. Everybody wanted to be Van Halen. And if you look further into the band, right, they have, of course, one of the most iconic lead singer, David Lee Roth, where bands were looking for David Lee Roth. But how many bands that when David left the band for whatever reason, I mean, there's different stories. David left the band, right? So in the 80s, a lot of people don't know, in the 80s, when you lose a band member, it hurts the band. I mean, it's not like nowadays you can replace 5 originals and have 1 original and people will still buy it just because of the name, but not in the 80s. It's a big deal. Now, AC/DC lead singer died, so that's different. You had a lead singer who left the band, and then you go out, right? You find Sammy Hagar, who just had his biggest hit song ever, join Van Halen. And what is so intriguing is when the 5150 album came out, they didn't even have a music video for MTV, and that album went #1. Where the album 1984 had what, Hot for the Teacher, Panama, Jump. I mean, how does that happen? I mean, it's just like, hey, we got a new singer. We're not. Do you think it's because we want you to hear our music? We don't want you to see it through a video. You're going to have to buy it. Was that the reason, or did Van Halen always did what they wanted to do?
Right, they did. And Edward always said, you know, that's why the covers with Edward was such a nasty thing. You know, he said, I'd rather fail with my own music than go and do somebody else's. And he also said to me one time, which was interesting, you know, maybe the people kind of listening here know, you know, so back in the day, I mean, that's all they were a cover band, right? But they covered everything. And Edward said, yeah, man, I got tired doing cover songs, you know, so he'd had enough of that. But to your point, yes, losing a band member in that period was horrible, because that was in the 80s. You're talking about, yeah, MTV was sort of around, but it was still kind of live performances and magazines, and there was just no getting around that. And to lose a singer was critical. I believe the reason that they did so well with Sammy, look, I'm not taking anything away from Sammy Hagar. The argument always comes up, well, what if they had another singer come in? It's an impossible theory to quantize, because that singer still would have been presented all that music that Edward had been writing, all the keyboard stuff, you know, certainly would have been different lyrics and melody. I believe that Van Halen did as well as they did, which was that #1 record at 5150, was because of Edward Van Halen and the music he was writing. I think that he was such an extraordinary talent that was ultimately going to shine through. Now, that being said, Van Halen fans would not accept a third lead singer in Van Halen. No, Gary Cherone, that could have been the greatest record ever made. That wasn't going to happen. No. So I believe that it was due to Edward and the music he was writing, and what he brought to it. But yeah, man, that is a rarity. And you bring up one of the other bands, right? So AC/DC, you think of, my God, how big they were and how big they got moving forward with Brian Johnson. It was a little different, right? Because Bond passes away.
And at the time, AC/DC wasn't American huge yet. Even though they had Highway to Hell, it was popular overseas, but it wasn't like staged in America yet. So it was almost like they're a brand new band to America.
Just about, you know, and I had this conversation with somebody trying to think of how many bands who had really made it losing a lead singer and then came back to be that huge again. And there was one or two others. I can't think of any offhand, but it's a pretty rare thing. So
it really is a rare thing. I mean, nowadays, what is it? Foreigner touring? Didn't we have one original person in it?
No, exactly. It happens a lot today. Again, because of the internet, and now you have so many millions of different ways to see a band and input. Yeah, so the singers and guitar players are gone. We'll still go out, you know.
And another thing, I don't think a lot of people talk about. I love music, so I loved getting into, you know, even smaller stuff. So in the 90s, we all know when grunge came out, grunge hurt all music, not just rock. I mean, Bruce Springsteen's sales went down when grunge came out. But if you really seriously think about it, it did not affect Van Halen at all, because that album Balance came out, I think, 95. And if you look at the sales, I know they don't really do sales credit no more, where back in the day, the bands would pay for it, so we know when they're certified. But if you look at the certified count, the album Balance that came out in the heart of grunge technically outsold the FUCK album.
Yeah, man.
People don't talk about that. I mean, people don't talk about that. I mean, even with grunge, could not defeat Van Halen. Yeah, and they didn't care about having videos on MTV because they didn't have a video until MTV sponsored and paid for the video off the OU 182 album, When It's Love.
No, man, that's an interesting point. I mean, you know, following that train of thought, just go back to the first record, which came out in the heart of punk and kind of new wave is starting to happen, right? The Sex Pistols,
or Ramones.
Right, exactly. And the Warners kind of saw them as sort of this, you know, maybe a little edgier kind of a punk band. I remember Edward was telling me some of the original artwork really made them out to be like this punk band. They said, no, man, we're not a fucking punk band. You know, this isn't what we are. So, yeah, it was just, they are one of those rarities. And you know, you talk about how we want to know everything about them. And we do, which is why you see virtually podcasts and stuff coming out just about every day on the band and the back and forth between the David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar era stuff, and you know, who said this and who said that, you know. I mean, you're talking about the band as much today as you were, you know, before Edward passed. That's okay, man. So yeah, they are an anomaly, and they certainly are one of the most important bands.
And you know,
whoever kind of existed in my mind.
Well, everybody who knows this channel knows a lot of my clips that I play most of the clips percentage-wise is Van Halen, and I have a playlist, and Van Halen, and a lot of my playlists, I have bands combined with other bands category. Van Halen is category by themselves. And, you know, talking about like what kind of music they are, I actually put out a clip this morning, and it's only a minute, on Sammy Hagar and Eddie Van Halen talking about the word heavy metal. I'll just play this clip real quick.
Going to, for shorthand, put Van Halen in the heavy metal category. Is that inaccurate?
I think we're just a from the heart rock and roll band, you know. I mean, well, now try to pigeonhole you, you know.
Now that there's speed metal and trash metal and all that, yeah, it's not quite so humiliating.
Yeah.
I got stupid there. But you know what I mean? It's like, you don't mind it as much. When that was like this outrageous, unthought of music, this trash, you know, what they call trash metal now, which I think is great, but I'm saying, but when heavy metal was considered like the unmusic thing,
right,
it was an insult, because this band is very musical. It's probably one of the most musical rock bands around, I think, you know.
It's the most musical band I've ever been in.
Same here.
And they're absolutely right, because back in the day, they would use the word like heavy metal was meant to take a shot at you. Even, you know, my channel, I call the hair metal on purpose because they used the word hair metal, glam rock, to make fun of bands. And I kind of like, you know, you can't make fun of this genre. I'm going to call this channel this because I believe in the music. At the end of the day, all the music comes down to it's all rock and roll. You could category any way you want, but like how Eddie said it, we're just a rock and roll band. We just go out there and have fun and play, you know. And when I watch all these videos, I don't know, is it me, Steve? It just seems like when I see videos like Eddie with David Lee Roth in them, that David's kind of like in his own world, even though they're doing interviews and stuff together. It seems like when he was with Sammy, they were truly best friends. It's really seemed to me at that time they really loved working with each other, creating music. It was like they really found each other as best friends, because Eddie was finally able to find somebody where he can experiment. He can use a bit more keyboards without hearing Dave, you know, because I don't know if it's true, but I've heard that David loves doing covers, and he didn't really want keyboards and all that, but it really felt like Eddie found its home with Sammy. Is that too far stretch?
No, that's very true. Just going back to your first point here about heavy metal. I did a cover story in Guitar World. I think it was 84. And I think I asked Edward about that. Hey, man, do you consider yourself, it might have been even early, do you consider yourself a heavy metal band? And he was really insulted by it. He goes, no, man. I said, well, do you feel any kind of an affinity? And I think I can't remember what bands. I think I might have mentioned Motley Crue or some other bands. He goes, no, man, I don't think we're anything like those bands. So he never considered himself a heavy metal band. Edward, before I get to this Edward and Sammy thing, Edward and Dave were never friends. Even from the beginning, they were just two different people. They were from the same.
They needed equipment, right? They needed equipment, so
right.
he got equipment and let him sing.
They needed a PA, so hey, man, rather than renting this guy David Lee Roth's PA, man, let's just get him in the band, right? Which is kind of how it happened, because Edward, and I write about it in Tone Chaser, Edward was never a huge fan of Dave's voice. He came to really respect what Dave brought to the band in terms of being the front guy and having that outsized ego. Dave had a lot to do with the look of the videos.
Yeah.
All that energy was Dave, but they were never like buddies. They never like hung out with each other.
And you can see that. And you can see that. You could tell watching interviews.
Right, absolutely. So yes, when Sammy joined the band, Edward was ecstatic, and I still have it. In fact, I put out an audio book, and I think this little excerpt, this audio is in the audio book. Edward called me, goes, "Hey man, you can't believe, man, we got Sammy Hagar. You won't believe Sammy's voice to my music." He was joyful. He was happy. It was an entirely different situation. Sammy was a guitar player. Sammy had a bigger range. Sammy was more open to the keyboard stuff. Dave famously said, "Hey man, you're a guitar hero. You can't play keyboards," when Edward's working on Jump, right? So Dave really knew what he was talking about, right? That's another story. But yes, they were good friends.
Yeah.
That honeymoon ended in acrimony, as we all know, and
all family members, they're such like brothers, all family members and families get into fights. I mean, it happens.
Yeah. But they were pretty close. They had houses next to each other in Malibu out here in California, the very wealthy part of town. And they, I think they really respected each other, and it was always about respect with Edward. So yes, they were very close friends in the beginning there.
And when I always hate about people, not hate about people, and they always say, Sammy joined the band, he changed your sound, he changed this. And Sammy used to come out and say, no, Eddie wanted, I let Eddie create the music part, the keyboards part, and we just combine, you know what I mean? And if anybody had never seen Sammy live, I'm not going on a stretch to say this. Out of like top 10, he is in the top 10, one of the best live vocals ever. I mean, he could hit every single range. And when I seen them live with Sammy, and I saw Sammy playing Cabo before, his solo bands, and his voice is just incredible, And no offense to David, sometimes I get tired of all the karate kicks in the air, all that kind of stuff. Sometimes to me, it comes down to the music and the voice. And Sammy fit the band perfectly. You couldn't ask for a better combination after a difficult situation where you just came off 1984, a huge album that technically should have went number one. Thriller killed a lot of number one spots, and to get Sammy and continue that magic is just amazing. It's I don't know how to explain it. It's magical. So, is it true to the point, because Eddie, like Eddie never really liked interviews. He said he always rather just play music live, be in the studio than doing interviews and all that. That was like his real personality, where he just wanted to play music? He didn't really care to talk to the media too much?
No, that was
more comfortable with Sammy when they were doing interviews.
Right, which is why you rarely saw one or the other of them doing an interview separately at that point in time. And yes, it is true. Edward really never liked doing interviews. And I think that came from, and people say he was shy or this and that. I don't think that had anything to do with it. He just honestly didn't like sort of talking about the music where he sort of had to look at it and maybe dissect it. And he was talking about, you know, the kind of licks he was playing. I don't think he thought about his music in that way. I think it was more of an emotional thing for him. So I just don't think he was ever comfortable. I'm sorry, man, my cat is walking around here. We would do interviews, and I did a lot of interviews with him starting in '78. And he always seemed to be very comfortable when I was talking to him. But he would say, "Oh man, I hate doing interviews," or, you know, there were points when he would feel so comfortable, I think, that he would say things like, "Oh, don't print that," or "Don't use that," meaning don't go and put that in a story I was writing, which I never did. Sort of connected to that is when we would be talking about music and we'd be talking about a record, and I remember kind of specifically, it was a Fair Warning record, and it was one of the songs, I forget which one, but one of the solos, even though all the solos on that record are freaking unbelievable, it was one of the solos, and I just kind of, you know, I nerded out. I go, "My God, Ed, the solo was so unbelievably good. It was just so incredible, you know." And you know, he kind of said, yeah, it was okay, you know. He was almost offended by it. Like, he didn't need to hear how good the solo was. Not to do with ego, but he knew he was a very good guitar player. And he was self-assured in that way. He didn't need to hear those things, you know. And I think in interviews, guys say, "Oh my God, you're the greatest fucking guitar player," and "Oh my God." I think it made him feel uncomfortable. Now, on the other side of that, there was a time when he was talking about one of his favorite songs, I forget which one it was, that he was really proud of. And, you know, he was saying, "Yeah, man, it was really good. I think I did a really good job on that," or whatever he said. And I had learned not to be like this sycophant, not to be like, "Oh my God, Ed, that's great, that's amazing." You know, don't say those things to him, because he doesn't want to hear them. It makes him uncomfortable. It makes him actually a little bit angry. So when he was telling me about this one song, about how great he thought the song was, you know, I was sort of reserved, and I thought, okay, don't go crazy here, don't go overboard. And the song was amazing, of course. And I go, "Yeah, man, it was good, you know." And so he goes, "Well, didn't you think it was good, man? I thought it was really good. It was neat." And when Edward said something was neat, that was his way of saying it's the best I could do, you know. So he was always sort of aware of me not responding to something that he did, and him thinking, "Oh, didn't Steve like it or not?" You know, which came down to respect. Respect was real big with Edward, and I know I'm kind of jumping all around here, but the thing that he had with Sammy was all based on respect. And with Dave, a lot of that respect got lost early on. Which ultimately contributed to the band falling apart. Yeah, he was a complex guy, you know, and it was hard to understand him at times. I mean, I hung out with him off and on for 26 years, and I still never really understood who he was. You know, it took me 580 pages and 14 months of writing a book to try to, you know, figure that out. And hopefully I came up with some answers, but a lot of it, yeah, man, still goes unknown.
Like, here's the here. Let me, because I got a video clip. Like I said, I got so many video clips of Van Halen. Like, here's one. They're talking about when it kind of went sour with David during the Fair Warning album.
A rough time for the band in terms of
Kind of a dark record.
yeah, it was also a dark experience with internally. Things that started to fall apart with Dave, in terms of just being together as a band, you know. And Ed, as an outsider, I could see what Ed was going through, and He spent a lot of time making that record. And that's why at that point in time, or near that time, is when Ed decided, I'm going to make my own studio.
It was actually after Diver Down.
Yeah, but it was, I know, that was a setup.
Yeah.
That's what
sequence
caused
of
the whole
events.
thing.
Yeah. Fair warning. I mean, I'd go down to Sunset Sound with Don Lanier, engineer, 4 o'clock in the morning, and do my guitar solos and do stuff. And the next day, everybody would walk in. They didn't even know.
Right.
They thought that I'd done it the day when everyone was there. But
there was a lot of
That's interesting because, like Eddie said, I don't want to walk down to a studio to do my guitar solos, and it kind of created where he wanted to do 5150 studio. And a lot of it is because he was tired, if it's true, that going to a studio with 10 Temperament and all them telling him what to make, what to do, and having his own studio, he was able to be him, free, and to get away from all those singles, because the album Diver Down, like you're talking about, he totally hated it because it was mostly all singles. And even though David loved doing remakes, he did not, because Eddie's too, I hate to say this, Eddie's too good for remakes. Eddie should be all original music, because that's what makes Van Halen, his certain guitar sound and all that. I'm not saying Oh Pretty Woman is not a good song of theirs, but I'd rather listen to all their music than remakes. So I get it why he made his own studio 5150.
Right. No, absolutely. And when Warner's told the band that You Really Got Me was going to be the first single, Edward was really bummed. He goes, why couldn't it have been one of our songs for the first single? He thought Jamie's Crying, which is what I thought, which I think is one of the best songs they ever did. Could have been a first single. But that being said, Fair Warning, that's when Edward, multiple guitar layering tracks, and he's orchestrating guitars and his solos. I remember talking to him about that record, which is probably maybe my favorite record. I think his playing and those songs are just unbelievable. I said, man, it sounds like an angry record. It's funny because here he calls it a dark record. I typified it as an angry record, and I joked. I said, were you an angry young man when you did that? And he kind of laughed, and that's all in Tone Chaser. I write about that. He said he just really, really took his time on doing that. He got sick doing it. I mean, physically sick. I mean, I think he had a terrible ulcer. I mean, a really bad ulcer from that. And he was pissed at Dave because Dave was supposed to be around for pre-production. I think he said Dave was off climbing some mountain somewhere. And again, what that translates into Edward is disrespect. That Dave didn't respect the band enough to be there for pre-production. And for Edward, you disrespect him like that, and it's never forgotten. I mean, cracks were forming in the armor before Fair Warning, but that was probably the tipping point. So
what's funny about Fair Warning, on my channel every single day I put up polls, different polls. So while last week I put up a poll of YouTube only allows you to put 4 options. That's it. You can't do any more. So I did a David Lee Roth era poll, and I can only put 4. So the way I decided the 4 that I put on there is what 4 out of the 6 albums with David sold the most. So those 4 sold the most. But everybody in the comments, Fair Warning's my favorite. Fair Warning. How come Fair Warning's on here? I was like, guys, I can only put 4. I can't put 5 or 6. I wish I could put more than 4. But it was interesting of how many people love Fair Warning. Now, of course, I knew in this poll, usually the debut album or 1984 is going to win. Now, my favorite of the David era is actually Women and Children's First. I absolutely love that album because I love the intro to the Whiskey song and the intro to Fools. I love the song Fools, how that sound, how the background vocals. And talking about background vocals, I got to say, Michael Anthony, we all know he's a great bass player, right? But the man's background vocals never gets talked about. Like if there's a top 10, top 5 best background vocals, Michael Anthony has to be on there because everybody knows David wasn't a fantastic live singer. He was good enough to pass, but it was the help of Michael Anthony and Eddie Van Halen background vocals that helped David along. And Michael Anthony's background vocals has got to be considered, in my opinion, top 5 because his voice, just like David and Sammy, is Van Halen. Is there a reason that people don't really talk about Michael Anthony, in your opinion, as a top tier player? He deserves it.
Yeah, man. I mean, honestly, I don't think it's a conscious thing. You know, you think of Michael
David. Everybody's always like, those are the greatest, and they kind of forget that Alex could easily be in the conversations, a top 10 drummer, and and Michael Anthony.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the other side of that, and you mentioned is that Edward sang as well. You know, Edward used to sing lead way back in the day.
Before David joined the band, yeah.
Right. I was talking with, I did an interview with Rudy Laren back in '86 when I was going to write Edward's Authorized biography. That book never happened. But I remember interviewing Rudy, and Rudy said that Edward used to sing the Who songs, and he sang like Young Man Blues and a bunch of those Who songs. He said he sang them really well. I remember asking Edward once, "Hey man, would you ever want to be a lead singer?" He goes, "Nah, man, no way." But Edward did kind of that. He was probably doing like the middle voice of those harmonies, and Michael obviously was doing that high tenor or soprano, whatever that is. Michael was a great singer. And he went on to sing, great with, in Sammy's band. He was a fantastic singer. And Mike also sang lead, back in his pre-Van Halen band.
Snake? Was it like something Snake?
Snake.
Yeah, his band before, and then kind of like took him away.
Yeah, well, they were smart. I mean, they recognized Michael as a bass player who could also sing, So Alex and Edward, had a sense of what was going to be required, and they were probably thinking harmonies early on, which is another element that sets Van Halen apart, right? You don't hear those other bands. In fact, rarely do you have a second person singing in any of those bands doing harmony parts. But Van Halen had these huge kind of, Beach Boys, Crosby, Stills and Nash harmonies. Not really, but they had, 3-part harmonies in a lot of those songs.
Like I said, just listen to the song "Fools." There's a section where it's just Eddie and Michael singing parts of it, and they're part of the creation of the music. And especially, listen, we all know when you record an album, you could have guest appearances doing background vocals on when you record albums. But when you hear them live, I mean, they really raised the bar with their background vocals.
Yeah, they were great live. And as you touched on before, yes, Dave was not a great singer live. His pitch was suspect, but Edward and Michael, man, they were always there. And I think at one point, again, I think in one of the interviews I did with Edward, that's in the Tone Chaser book, he talks about how their harmonies kind of, created that foundation for Dave to kind of sit in. They made that. They provided a vocal pocket for him, so to speak. So,
I love when I listen to like other singers from like other bands and maybe a tiny bit like a different genre type of music. For example, like I was listening to Billy Joe Armstrong from Green Day with Eddie Trunk, and he was talking to Eddie Trunk about how he traveled when Van Halen got back together with David doing live. He said his favorite part, he got to go backstage. He says his favorite part when he got to see how Eddie and his son Wolfgang were interacting about tuning their guitar and bass. He said he felt the true love of family and all that. And it just tells me how strong that Eddie is with his family because, him and Alex, you ain't going to talk shit about them because they'll fight back easily. but it just shows you the love he has for his band members. And when Billy's talking about just seeing Wolfgang and when you look at Wolfgang today, his son that can play drums, play guitar, plays bass, and Wolfgang's first album is all him. I mean, just the blood of the family, right? Because I know everybody knows the story. Eddie was playing drums, or Alex was playing guitar, and they switched. And I have a video clip of Eddie saying when he picked up a guitar, it was like it was like easy. It was just like, I don't know, it's like candy. I just picked it up and knew what to do. I mean, was that really Eddie? He just picked up a guitar and he just came that easy to him, as he said he did.
He was a pretty gifted dude, right? And he talks about playing piano and this and that.
Piano for his parents.
Right. Later we hear him on Jump and those kinds of songs. I think that had Edward wanted to, he could have been a classical pianist. I mean, he was a rare diamond, for sure. You talk about Wolfgang. One of the last interviews I ever did with Edward, and this is probably somewhere around 2003, and I can't remember my chronology exactly, but I think Wolf would have been about 11. So this is way before Wolf was in the band. But one of the conversations I'm having with Edward is, oh, you can't believe my son and how he plays. And I taught him how to play drums in 3 minutes. And anybody else telling you that, you go, yeah, right. Your son learned how to play drums. Well, obviously, Edward Van Halen's son learning drums in 3 minutes is not a stretch of the imagination. And Ed was telling me, this is a phone conversation. He goes, yeah, man, I told Wolf, I go, just stamp your foot on the ground, 1, 2, 3, 4, then take hand and, and 2 minutes, 3 minutes later, he was playing, but I could hear in his voice what kind of joy that was bringing to him. And actually, if I go back a little further, well, actually quite a bit further, and this is probably in the mid 80s, one of the interviews I did with him, and sometimes we would just veer off and just talk about life, right? And it really had nothing to do with the band specifically, or his guitars. I remember asking him once, would you like to have kids? And obviously this is way before Wolf. This is, again, probably 85, 86. And he goes, yeah, that'd be okay, And I said, would you want, your kids to be in music? And I thought his response would be, yeah, man, they better be in music, And he said, yeah, if they want to be. I just thought that was so remarkable, for him to be to allow them to kind of do whatever they want, as opposed to wanting them to follow in his footsteps as a sort of an honoring his legacy, but I thought that was amazing. But yes, I believe that that Wolf coming into the world truly saved Edward. I think without Wolf's birth, I think Edward would have, and I hate to say this, and this is just my own thoughts, I think Edward would have been really lost in this world, and maybe he would have gone before he eventually did. But Wolf brought him a new life, and the fact that Wolf was this gifted guitar player, musician, the fact that they were able to play in that band together, I think that was everything to Edward. And yes, that love you see that Billy Joe Armstrong saw, that was real. With Alex, yes, they loved each other. I saw moments when the love turned into frustration with each other, like all brothers.
Every family.
Yeah, but pretty amazing, pretty remarkable.
Your opinion, like, we all know stories, the dysfunction of the Van Halen camp and all that. And I know there were talks about giving Eddie a true tribute show or whatever, and to this day, I still wonder, even with all the troubles they have within the camp, how come they just cannot get over each other just to do, I don't know, one night tribute to Eddie, where Foo Fighters did a tribute to their bass player, or to their drummer, who wasn't even original band. He wasn't even the original band member off the first couple albums. Like, do you have any insight? Like, why did it just not happen? Because Eddie deserves it.
Right. It's an interesting question, and I believe I do have maybe an explanation or one explanation. And there's somebody out here, Danny Staten, who asked about a Valerie story here, and this sort of ties in. So again, going back to 1986, I was going to write Edward's Authorized Biography. So I think this is right after Sammy joined the band. So they had released 1984. They were arguably the biggest band in the world. Edward was the most famous and influential guitar player in the world, arguably. And I thought to myself, as a journalist, writers are going to approach Edward and they're going to want to write his life story. Well, I want to be the person to do that. So it literally took me months to build up the balls to ask him that. And I thought about two things happening when I asked. One is he's going to say no, which would have been heartbreaking, which I could have understood. It's his life. And two, he was going to say yes. And now it's like, oh, fuck, now I've got to write the book. And now what do I do? So
you want him to be good.
Yeah, exactly. But I did ask him, and literally 2 minutes later, he goes, yeah, man, it has to be you. I can't think of anybody else. And
That's so awesome.
Right. That was pretty remarkable. And I write about that in the book. And there's actually little contracts that we signed that are pretty amazing to look at. Little one-page contracts that I typed up. Crazy. So I start working on the book. And I literally worked on that book probably for about 4 years, gathering interviews, interviewing the rest of the band and his boyhood friends and promoters of shows in Pasadena and friends, blah, 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 trying to get Edward to sit down so I could interview him for the book. Look, I'd done a lot of interviews with him for the guitar mags, and I'd done all the guitar talk, but I needed him to sit down and talk to him about his family and what was it like growing up in, Europe, and, what was he like in school when he was a little kid, and, all that stuff. And every time I'd ask him that question, he'd go, well, man, now is not the right time. Now is not the right time. Now is not the right time, which I understood because he was always working on music and he always would be working on music. But I think the other side of him, I don't think he had any grasp at all, at least at that time, and this is 85, 86, of his own legacy and the influence that he had on an entire generation of guitar players. I don't think he really comprehended what that was. And so for that reason, and hey, it's fair enough, he didn't see the importance of a book. I thought the book was very important, not because I was writing it. Yes, I had a vested interest, of course, but because I thought it was part of that legacy. All these great artists had books about them, as well as the music, and I tried to explain that to him. He couldn't understand it. Valerie was totally in favor of the book. I used to see her quite a bit when I'd go up to 5150. I lived in Laurel Canyon, which was like the cheap part of the Hollywood Hills. Edward lived in Coldwater, in the expensive part with Valerie. And so I was over there a lot, and Valerie would be home a lot. And once she found that I was working on the book, she goes, man, you got to push him harder. You got to try harder. And I go, well, I don't want to push him too hard. She goes, no, you got to do the book. You got to do the book. She got it. And I think it was because of her. Look, she grew up in the spotlight as well, right? She was a child star. She understood that, what celebrity was and the importance of it. And she wanted me to do the book. Fast forward all these years. Yes. Why is there no tribute concert? That being said, why has there never been a box set? There is a box set on every obscure band who's ever recorded a record. 10 CDs you've never heard of from bands that don't deserve it, you know? I mean, I can't even think of any off the top of my head. There's no box set of Van Halen. You mean to tell me that Warner Brothers couldn't have gotten it together to put together a box set? All of the archives that exist out there in the Van Halen estate, in those vaults, and I'll tell you why, because somehow the legacy of the band, it's just not important, which to me, I find is a travesty. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. Look, it's their history. You know, they can do whatever they want, but I think, yes, I think if they care anything about fans, it's an insult to fans. I don't understand it. Look, I'm not saying I wrote the book for this reason, but in my little world, writing that book was sort of my little piece of this legacy. You know, I knew this guy and I have these stories and I want to share these stories with you, you know. So here's my little contribution, you know. I don't know, man. I find it, I can't understand it. I really can't.
See, Steve, your book is important. Your book is very important because most of the information that we get on the internet, it's from interviews, clips, you know, back in the day of MTVs and stuff. You know, when none of it's really like personal, you know, with your book, you're able to sit there with them and get the story straight. You know, what really happened, what this happened, and, you know, put it all together. So it's almost like if you want the truth nowadays, go to the source who spent time with them. Because you didn't, like you said, you didn't write a book never knowing him. You were with him. You were at his house. I mean, that's the closest we're ever going to get with the great Eddie. Because one thing that people say about Van Halen camp is you don't really get a lot, like you said. A lot of the clips I show with Eddie down his 5150 studio, he had all these tapes. He goes, I got guitar solos, I got all this. And like you're saying, he got thousands of hours of recorded stuff. You know there's songs in there. You know they could do so many things with it. But it's like the strangest thing. You know, even Sammy and Michael Anthony says, you know, they've called Alex, hey, let's do something together. Let's do a one-day show where you're playing drums or do one song. Or can we put this in a movie or something? And then Alex will say, no. It's such a weirdest thing that, to me, to celebrate Eddie is to get his stuff out there, because you never know. A new kid in the block might hear something and say, oh my God, who's that? You know, and it'll inspire that kid to one day become a band. You know what I mean? I mean, Eddie is inspiration, not just back in those days of 70s, 80s, and 90s. He's still an inspiration today. And today is harder than ever to get a music career going. You know? So yeah. He's just inspiration altogether. And I think you doing that book and stuff, and I wrote in the chat your book here. I had the link up. And in the description, people, is the link to his book, tonechaserbook.com. Here we go. And there's the .com. Just click on it. And you also have the book in audio form. So you could drive in your car, put it on, kick back and cruise.
Right, man. So in response to several things you just mentioned, Eric, yes, there are some other amazing books out there about Edward, but typically they are just based on interviews that the writer has done with Edward, which is fair enough. But I was lucky, you know, yeah. I got to spend all of these hours and all this time with him. And I realized, you know, what a rare individual he was. And you know, I wanted to share that with people, you know. So I tried to write this book as honestly as I could. And it's a very honest book. And it's very, the last thing I wanted was to write a gossipy book or anything like that, you know. That wasn't the intention, but it had to be honest. And the response has been remarkable. I think people really understood it, and they were right to me, go, oh, thank you for writing the book. You know, I now know a little bit more about Edward than I did before, and that's the whole point of it. So yes, I don't think there's any other books out there like mine. So if you don't have it, you should go get it. I mean, honestly, I think you guys will dig it. Now, the audiobook. So the first edition of my book came out in 2020. We're now in the third edition. I never really thought about an audiobook, but then I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, I need to find somebody to narrate it. And I listened to you know, sort of other music audiobooks where they had these professional narrators, and they were good. These, you know, everything was eloquent and the voice modulation, but there was no emotion in it. It sounded like there were robots reading this text, and I thought, that's ridiculous. I mean, that's not what my book is, you know. So then I thought, well, maybe I could read it. And so I started trying to read it and realized, my God, this is really difficult. I'm not a trained narrator. And we talked early on, Eric, you talk for an hour, man, and your voice, if you don't know how to modulate, blah, blah, it goes, you know. So I get through like an hour, and then I thought, oh my God, am I sounding too, does it sound too corny? Does it sound too maudlin, where it's like soap opera? Do I sound too comical? You know, trying to find that balance. At the end of the day, I think I did a pretty good job. It took me 8 months to get through this book. You know, there's like 250,000 words. So initially what I was going to do is I was going to narrate the entire book. All of the interviews we've been talking about in the hardback, I was going to narrate. So you were going to hear in the audiobook my voice. The question, Edward, when did you start playing guitar? Edward Van Halen. Oh, I started playing guitar when I was 13. And I thought to myself, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. That's inane. That's no one's going to believe that, because everybody knew what Edward's voice sounds like, you know. So anyway, I thought, well, how do I get around that? I thought, oh, here's an idea, which I've never heard any other audiobook do. Why don't I use the actual interviews I did with Edward back in the day and embed those in the audiobook? So what you are hearing in this audiobook is like 20 hours of the original interviews I did with him dating back to 1978. And the stuff is amazing. And a lot of the audio is even more complete than what you're reading in the hardback. Because, you know, if there were some lines in the hardback where he was just kind of hemming or hawing, I would just take that out in the text. But in the audiobook, you hear all of that. Plus, there's all these little bits where he's noodling on guitar, and I'm jamming with him, and you hear him playing through his Les Paul, through my Marshall. This stuff's amazing.
Really?
There's a second audiobook that came out in January, which I've called Van Halen's Voices, and those are a lot of the interviews I did back in the day when I was going to write the biography. So there's interviews with Alex Van Halen, an incredible like 6-hour interview I did with Alex in 86. There's an interview with Mike, with Dave. I did one with Gary Sharon. That was much later. There's one with Sammy that he did by himself after joining the band, which is pretty rare, and a bunch of friends and guitar techs and stuff. So yeah, man, the audiobook audiobooks are pretty remarkable.
One of the reasons why I love audiobooks is because, you know, we all have a hectic lifestyle, you know, going to work every day and everything. So a lot of times at work, I would play things in the background, and I love to let the audiobook play while I work.
Yeah,
you know,
cool.
home, it's hard to, right? Making dinner, walk the dog, your wife, whatever, the kids. So sometimes audiobooks, I'll go to work, I'll play it loud and get my work done. I get a lot of good information. So
yeah, cool, man.
We're gonna wind down here a little bit, and So I think you answered this earlier, but just for fun, we're getting to the end of the show here. I know it's hard because every album Van Halen is great in certain ways, but what's your favorite David era Van Halen album, and what's your favorite Sammy Hagar era album?
Well, I mentioned before Fair Warning, but that first record is pretty incredible. And just a quick note here. I heard that first record when it was sent to me by Warner's in February '78. I was on mailing lists, so we get all the monthly releases from the labels. And that February '78 release included Van Halen. There was a Manfred Mann record in there. There was a Little Feat record in there. I put the Van Halen record on, and I didn't think it was very good. I thought, that's okay. I thought Deep Purple did all that fast shuffle stuff much better. I listened to it the next day more closely and realized, oh my God, this guy is changing the world, right? So that first record, I mean, his guitar tone, his riffs, the fact that it was sort of a three-piece, and the rhythm would drop out and he would do a solo and there'd be no rhythm part, which I loved. It was, really harkened back to earlier records from the 60s. Probably the 5150 record. I think those were all ideas that had been percolating with Edward, and the keyboards come more to the front. I think he really expands his horizons as a songwriter.
I did lie. Somebody asked me in the chat, you got to ask him this one question. It has nothing to do with Van Halen, but Danny's a great guy to my channel. He's faithful. He's awesome. So I'm gonna ask this question, even though it's not a Van Halen question.
Okay.
Is Born Again the best Sabbath album?
Yeah, not for me. I mean, Danny must be a hardcore guy. I mean, I remember the first Sabbath record, and I loved it because you could play all those riffs, right? You could play all those Tony Iommi riffs. And as a guitar player who never got any good, I could play, all those, I could play Black Sabbath, the song, and all those early riffs. Also, I interviewed the band early on. I interviewed them in '74, which wasn't long after that first record came out. So sort of, romantically, nostalgically, I kind of go back to that first record. So
now, Danny, that's kind of a hard question. Who was Sabbath's best vocalist? Listen, everybody knows Ozzy Osbourne is Black Sabbath, but everybody knows Ronnie Dio had one of the best live vocalists ever. Dio can really sing live. Now, my two favorite, like I said, they're all great. I love Women and Children First. I love that whole album. I love the sound of it. First favorite. For Sammy Hagar, I love the FUCK album. I really, truly love it. Now, 5150 was great because even though they said they added more keyboards, but it seemed like there was a lot more intro guitar, Summer Nights, the guitar, the 5150, the guitar in the beginning. The best of both worlds, the guitar riffs. I mean, 5150 has some iconic riffs. I even today, I actually put out a poll for today of that one of the top 4 Van Halen riffs. I use a website to determine it, but I said it cannot be a single or they could not have a video for it. And it was interesting when I did the data, 2 of the riffs came from Sammy era, Summer Nights and Cabo Wabo. And it talks about the riffs in the song Mean Street and Hear About Later. And it looks like Mean Street is the song that's winning. Like I said, when I put these pools together, I use data. I just don't say these are the 4 best. I use data. But 5150, the intros to some of those songs are just terrific. I mean, I don't think the song 5150 gets enough credit listening to that guitar riff and how Sammy just sings that song almost with no background vocals. It's mostly all him. I mean, such a brilliant album. But why is it? Last question. But why is it a lot of Van Halen albums? They're only 9 songs. How come they could never go to 10? I mean, a lot of their albums are only 9 songs.
It probably had more to do with Warner Brothers saying, "Hey, man, you know, there's only room on the record for 9 songs." So, yeah. I mean, if you think about some of the records back in the day, I mean, you know, you'd have like 3 songs on the side. You know, some of the songs so long. But I know what you mean, though, man.
But first of all, Steve, I want to thank you so much for coming on this channel. I appreciate it so much. I mean, I could talk hours. I just love listening to Van Halen's story. Just, you know what I mean? Just the band means so much to all of us. And to know that there's a book, not just there's a book out, you spent years and time with him at his house and got in really deep with the information you have in your book. And we all appreciate that so much. And you got to come back again in the future. I would love to have you on here, you know, next month when you get free time. Because I just love like this. I just love chatting with you. I didn't write down no interview questions or nothing. I just wanted to speak raw with you and just have fun.
Well, cool, man. I had a great time. I'll come back anytime. And yeah, lots of fun. Go buy my book. I think you guys will love it. If you don't, if somebody buys a book and you don't love it, I'll let you keep the book and I'll refund your money.
Wow.
So, okay. There you go.
And if you don't like the book, I'll let you come on here for whatever reason. But I know you guys are going to love it. And guys,
yeah, absolutely.
In the description. It's in the description of the show. If you look down there, the link is in there. So, or you can just type in Tone Chaser on Google.
Yeah.
You're going to find it.
Yeah. Exactly.
So
you'll find it.
Ways. And if I could recommend audio, because that's the way you can listen to it in the car, you can listen to it at home, at work, you know what I mean? You can dissect it and all that. So Steve, again, thank you so much for coming on the channel. I appreciate it. This is my second live show ever on this channel. And every year I'm making June 24th now the Van Halen day for this channel. And again, I put out 2 clips every single day. One at 6 a.m. in the morning and at 2 p.m. I put out a Van Halen clip this morning. And there's another Van Halen clip coming out at 2 p.m. to honor Van Halen Day. So nice. Again, thank you so much. I'll speak to you soon.
Cool. See you, everybody. Thanks.